this evening. I want to believe that we have more persons gathered in those two areas we've made available for persons discuss or share our views, implement change, and provide feedback on the proposed revised Education Act that will affect all of us, whether we are directly involved in the education system or not. We may have children, we may have relatives, we may have friends. So we have a chance now to make suggestions, to make proposals, to give our feedback on what will be presented to us tonight. And so I want to applaud those of you who made the effort, and I'm hoping move on, more persons will join in and contribute to what is ours. And so this opportunity is yours. For persons who may not be too fluent in English, you are also encouraged to make your contribution in Patois or Creole. I will try to translate as much as possible. If I cannot, I'm sure there are persons on the call that can do so. And so I welcome you to our District 5 leg of the consultation on the revised Education Act. With anything, we always believe in God, and so let me invite us, wherever we may be, to get ourselves in a frame of reverence to our Lord, our Savior. As I pray, Father in heaven, we thank you once again. We give you praise, glory, and honor, for this is the day that you have made. We will continue to rejoice and be glad in it. Father, as we gather here as persons, as stakeholders with interest in what may affect us, we pray, the Lord, that you will intervene. You'll give us wisdom, you'll give us direction, you'll give us the know-how, Father, to chart the best way forward for the students and those involved. And so, Father, we pray, Lord, that this discussion will be a healthy one. We pray, Lord, that we'll all make our contribution respectfully. And Father, in the end, all things will bring glory and honor to you. So we thank you again. I pray, Lord, that you take full charge of tonight's discussion. In Jesus' name I pray thanksgiving. Amen. At this time, let me say too that when it's our turn to make our contribution, let's do so respectfully, and let's all have a healthy discussion. Let us all contribute to what is ours and what will affect us. And so at this time, let me not waste any time again. So let me introduce our consultant for the night, and that is Dr. Monica Williams. So we welcome Dr. Williams to deliver on the revised Education Act at this time. So thank you and all the best. You will have your chance to share, and of course I'll come back at the end. I will be on board to do the wrap up. So all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jarif, for the warm welcome and the devotion to start our discussion tonight. We're very pleased to be here to meet with you, and we're really looking forward to hear the questions and comments from everybody present. At this time, I'd like to pause and introduce my colleagues who are also here to help facilitate the session tonight. Mrs. Paula Cook-McKinnon. Paula, if you would like to say hi.
Good morning. Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you this evening and to have what promises to be an interesting discussion about the proposed Education Act and regulations. We look very forward to your feedback and to the discussion that's going to occur this evening.
Thank you very much. And Mrs. Fortuna Anthony, who is certainly no stranger to education in St. Lucia. Fortuna, if you could say a few words of greeting, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Good evening to everyone. It is indeed our pleasure that we are here and prepared to listen to your contribution to such a critical document, the Enhanced Education Act. I'm looking forward to a very stimulating discussion coming from persons present. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Mrs. Anthony. Next slide, please, Paula. So our schedule for this evening is as follows. The session is about an hour and a half long. So we've commenced with our welcome, devotion, and introductions. We're going to go over the purpose and the ground rules for the meeting. Then we're going to provide a brief description of the review of the Education Act that's been taking place since February of 2022, so almost 2 years now. We're also going to provide an overview of the core features of the Draft Education Act and regulations that are being proposed. We want to hear from you, so we're keeping the presentation time as brief as possible. We're having multiple pauses for discussion, but you can stop us at any time to ask a question or make a comment. We really want to hear from you. And as we go along toward the end of the meeting, we're going to be asking you what your priorities and hopes are for the Draft Education Act and regulations. What do you think is most important to address in this work? And what do you hope comes out of an updated Education Act and regulations? We'd really like to hear your priorities and your hopes. At 7:25, we're going to have concluding remarks and a thank you from Mr. Jarif, who kindly opened the meeting just now. And around 7:30, we will adjourn. So that's our schedule for this evening. Next slide, please. What is the purpose of the town hall meetings? And we're having them right across St. Lucia. We're having 10 different meetings. The first purpose is to describe the review and the enhancement of the Education Act, the current act, which is from 2005. So we want to provide the members of the public with information about the review that's been happening and the progress that's been made so far. We also want to discuss the main changes that are present in the proposed Education Act versus the current Act of 2005. So we're going to go through the core features that have changed and give you an overview of that. We really want to listen to your priorities and hopes for the Act, as I mentioned a moment ago, because as Mr. Jarif pointed out, this is a huge undertaking. The impact of the Education Act affects all sectors of St. Lucia society, even for people who are not directly involved in education, families, community members, businesses, everyone is impacted by education. We're going to record your questions and comments. So tonight's session, like all the others, is being recorded. And then we're going to analyze your questions and comments to address the topics and issues that you raise in the validation and finalization of the Draft Education Act and regulations. So your contributions here tonight, along with all the others from the town hall meetings, will be analyzed and considered as the Education Act goes through another round of edits to finalize it for submission to the government for consideration. Next slide, please. So here are some meeting ground rules. Again, we want to emphasize that your questions and comments are welcomed at any time. Myself, along with Mrs. Anthony and Mrs. Cook McKinnon, will be chairing the meeting this evening. We're attempting to start and end promptly out of respect for everyone's busy schedules, especially during the month of December. You may, if you like, place comments or questions in the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat box and responding to input as we go. To speak during the meeting, please raise your hand. And if you're not familiar with the Zoom function for raising your hand, if you look at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar, you'll see an icon with a smiley face and a plus sign that's called Reactions. If you click on Reactions, you will see an icon come up to raise your hand. So you simply click on that and we will see your hand raised and address your question or comment. And we'll be watching for those as we go. We're asking that when we do call on you, you state your name and share your question or comment in 3 minutes or less so that as many people as possible have the chance to speak tonight. We're trying to make sure that anyone who wants to contribute will have enough time to do so. We appreciate and respect all questions and comments and ask that you do the same. If there's one thing that we've learned over the past 2 years, we've certainly learned that St. Lucians are very passionate about education, and they have many different experiences and perspectives and opinions on what should and should not be in a new Education Act. Sometimes those opinions conflict, which is fine. That's the importance of conversation and hearing all sides of an issue. But it's important to listen carefully and respect the different viewpoints that people have to offer. Next slide, please. So now we'll turn to a brief description of the review of the Education Act. In February of 2022, the St. Lucia Department of Education contracted with Mindbloom Consulting and St. Francis Xavier University to partner with St. Lucia educators in the review and enhancement of the Education Act. And I want to emphasize that word partner. This has been a very collaborative project. We've worked extensively with educators across the island and with many different organizations and groups in completing the review collaboratively. The review was undertaken because the existing Education Act is from 2005, and the Department of Education wants to ensure that the Education Act meets the needs of a modern education system and today's students now and in the future. Especially in the wake of the pandemic, we've all seen major changes occurring in society and in education. And it was felt that it was time to revisit the Act in order to make sure that it's current. Next slide, please. Thank you. So from February of 2022 up to the present time, extensive stakeholder consultations and research have been completed. To give you a few examples, and these are just a few examples, there are many more, we've consulted with many different groups, including the Office of the Attorney General of St. Lucia, the National Accreditation Council, the National Principals Association, the St. Lucia Teachers Union, the OECS Commission, ministry leaders from the Department of Education. Many groups and individuals have been consulted. We've also conducted research, and that's ongoing today. We've looked at education acts and policies from across the Caribbean and around the world. We've also looked at the issues that are emerging in education systems in the Caribbean and around the world, and the best practices for addressing them. And so this research is ongoing. And as we come upon new information that's pertinent, we certainly add that to the mix, whether that comes from input from consultations or from the research that's being conducted. So based on the findings of the consultations and research, the first draft Education Act and regulations were prepared in March of 2023. So after more than a year of consultation and study, we prepared an initial draft to collect feedback and to hear from various members of the St. Lucia Society about their thoughts on moving forward with changes to the Act. The response was tremendous. Multiple stakeholders provided feedback on this first draft. We received more than 700 suggestions, and each of those suggestions were reviewed and considered and acted on to create the draft Education Act and regulations that we are discussing here. So we're looking at a very recent draft that was just completed a couple of weeks ago, and we're taking it out for public consultation right away to get even more input and opinions from members of the public in St. Lucia to ensure that we're on the right track and to ensure that from the outset, this is your Education Act. This is for the people of St. Lucia, for the students, for the society, for the government, and we want to ensure we make every effort to engage St. Lucians in this process. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, town hall meetings are being held across St. Lucia to provide members of the public with the opportunity to give their input on this latest draft. And we're holding the meetings to provide a description of the review of the Education Act of 2005 and the progress that has been made so far. We're also conducting the town halls to make sure that members of the public have access to the latest draft, the November 2023 Draft Education Act and regulations. and they are available publicly at a website, and we will ensure that website is included in the chat box this evening, so that anyone can look at the Draft Education Act and regulations, and we encourage you to do that because they are so impactful for the people of the country. We're also providing this opportunity for you to contribute to the validation and finalization of the Draft Education Act and regulations. Next slide, please. So what are the major changes from the 2005 Act? What are some of the core features of this current Draft Education Act and regulations that are different from what's been there so far? Well, first of all, the Draft Act begins with a new student-centered vision for education for St. Lucia. And this is contained in what's called the long title at the beginning of the Draft Education Act. And the student-centered vision speaks about the importance of a modern and inclusive curriculum that meets the needs of St. Lucia students, that prepares them for success in school and life, and prepares them to be good citizens and contributing members of society. The student-centered vision also speaks about the whole child, not just their achievement on examinations, for example, but their learning, their development, and their physical and mental well-being. So those are some of the key focal points in this student-centered vision for education. We've also, at the request of many St. Lucians, completed extensive work on the definitions and the language in the Education Act. Many persons told us that some of the definitions were outdated and no longer accurate. Other persons told us that more definitions needed to be added to the Act. And so that section has been expanded significantly. We have increased the number of definitions, and they're found in the interpretation section at the start of the Education Act. We also heard from many persons that the language used throughout the Act was no longer accurate. For example, there are programs that are referenced in the current Act that are no longer offered in St. Lucia, and some of the terminology in various areas, including special education needs, were no longer in keeping with the language that's used today. So for all of those reasons, we did quite a bit of work on strengthening the definitions and making sure that the language is current and accurate to the extent possible. Throughout the Education Act and the regulations, there is one unifying focus on holistic education that supports student learning and well-being and development, everything from positive behavior to the national curriculum, instruction, and assessment that upholds the different cultures and languages and peoples of St. Lucia. So really trying to provide a well-rounded education that meets all of the students' needs. We've also included in this latest draft universal access to education so that all children have access to education in St. Lucia, and free tuition, which means that they have access to education without their parents being charged for that. Also, that the students have protection from discrimination. And what that means is they cannot be denied an education on the basis of their ethnic background, their language, their gender, their family's political affiliation, all those different prohibited grounds. So those are major steps forward that are present in the current draft of the Education Act. We've also added a new council on special needs education and inclusive education to the Act. And this was in response to requests from many persons and community groups and organizations that more attention needed to be paid to the area of special needs education, and that it was important to have a group who would advocate for and provide leadership for the provision of education that meets the needs of learners, whether they have challenges with their learning, whether they're gifted and they require enrichment, So this council will provide support in that direction. Also, for the first time, we've included a new national code of conduct in both the Act and the regulations. And this code of conduct emphasizes positive behavior, supports for positive behavior, and it also recognizes that at times there's student misbehavior, and there are clearly spelled out responses to student misbehavior contained in the national code. Also, there are standards for behavior and standards for appropriate dress that are described in detail in this new code. One of the things that we heard from many St. Lucians was that although the various schools have school rules for behavior, they differ from one school to the next, and there was a desire to have a national standard that everyone could look to and reference to support positive behavior in school communities by everybody who's involved. We've also expanded the compulsory school age. It is currently 5 to 15 years, and in the new draft, it's expanded to 3 to 17 years, so that now it includes early childhood education for children ages 3 to 5. Again, a major step forward to have an increased emphasis on early childhood education, which was another area that was identified by many St. Lucians as being one that required more attention in the Education Act. We also heard from many educators their concerns that they did not feel they had clear authority to discipline students and protect the safety and security of students and staff and school premises. We've heard many people speak about their concerns about violence, about threats to safety and security on school grounds. And so in the Act, it now contains a very clear line of authority for teachers and principals and vice principals to discipline students when necessary. Also new in the Act is a provision that if there is a threat to the safety and security of students or staff that's posed by a student who perhaps has brought a weapon to school or illegal drugs to school, or is threatening to harm his or herself or others, the principal or teacher can act. They can search the student, seize the weapon or the illegal drugs. They can take action to protect safety and security. And also in the Act, it's clearly referenced that there are obligations to contact police when criminal acts have taken place on school grounds, and that's spelled out as well. So we really have taken a variety of steps to try to address the need to strengthen the supports for safety and security. We've added many new types of education, including alternative, online, and blended education. Especially during and after the pandemic, we've seen the rise of virtual online learning, blended education, that's a combination of in-person and online learning. And we've heard repeated calls for more support for alternative education, which means non-traditional pathways are provided for secondary students to successfully complete school. Not all students are academically inclined, but they have many other skills and talents. And alternative education allows them to learn about different occupations, to do hands-on learning, project-based learning, to prepare for skilled trades, and many other lines of work. So this is a need that has been identified, and we've addressed that in the new Act. Also, there were many requests to define the rights, duties, powers, and responsibilities of the persons who are involved most directly in education. And we've attempted to do that. We've used a consistent format and language describing the rights and duties of everyone from the Minister of Education and the Permanent Secretary and Chief Education Officers and Chief Education Officer and education officers to students and parents and teachers, principals, vice principals, and for the first time, school counselors. Their duties were not described in the current Act of 2005, and they've been added, again, at the request of many individuals. Education officers' duties have been added for the first time as well. So this is another step ahead. Next slide, please. So in the next two slides, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the sections of the Education Act, the Draft Act, and then we're going to go into discussion. But as I'm going along, I want to repeat, if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question, or you want to put a question in the chat box, you can do so at any time, and we're happy to respond. So with regard to the Draft Education Act, the preliminary section at the start includes the long title that contains the student-centered vision of education, the interpretation section that contains the definitions, and also there is the purpose of the Education Act, which is spelled out in this section. Part 1 deals with the administration of the education system, and this speaks to the duties and powers of senior leaders at the Department of Education, including the Minister, Permanent Secretary, Chief Education Officer, education officers, and also the role of education advisory boards. Part 2 describes the different stages of education and types of schools in St. Lucia. So the stages of public school, for example, include early childhood, primary, secondary, and tertiary. The different types of education, as I mentioned a few moments ago, include in-person, online, alternative, special needs education, many different types. We've also described the process for registration and operation of schools. And we had many, many requests to provide more structure and clarity around homeschooling. And we have done that. It has a great deal more detail has been added into the Draft Act around the requirements for homeschooling, inspections for homeschooling, and the programming approval process for homeschooling through the Office of the Chief Education Officer. As I mentioned earlier, we've also increased the amount of attention paid to special needs education and inclusive education in this section of the Act. Part 3 describes the rights and responsibilities of students and parents, and I've discussed some of the rights before, including universal access to education and free tuition. Also, we've outlined student accountability. So students have rights, but they also have responsibilities, including following the direction of their teachers and school administrators, and also attending school regularly and punctually. Similarly, parents have rights and duties under the Draft Act. One of the duties of the parents is to communicate and collaborate with teachers and school administrators in the education of their child. One of their rights is to be informed about their child's progress and participate in their child's education. Part 4 deals with admission, attendance, and records. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the compulsory school age has been expanded to 3 to 17 years. And we describe the processes for students being admitted to school, the zoning of schools, the process when a student transfer is requested. And we've also addressed student attendance, which was another area of concern that many people identified. In St. Lucia and across the Caribbean and around the world, student attendance has fallen off significantly since the pandemic, and every education system is trying to come up with strategies to get student attendance back on track. We've updated the roles and responsibilities of student attendance officers to provide them with the authority to address truancy issues, student absenteeism. And we've also described in this section school records to be kept on all students. Part 5 is the national curriculum, instruction, and assessment of students. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, looking for a modern, inclusive national curriculum that upholds the different cultures and histories and languages of St. Lucia, that is tailored to St. Lucia. It is a curriculum for St. Lucia specifically, designed and tailored for the students in your country. We describe the core subjects, the key stages of assessment, And also in this section, we talk about balanced student assessment. So a recognition that while examinations and tests certainly have a place in education, it's also important to use other forms of assessment on a regular basis, including diagnostic assessment to determine where students are in their learning, and formative assessment to constantly monitor their progress in the classroom as they're learning the different subjects. Next slide, please. Part 6 deals with the management of schools, including boards of management, the TVET Council, also students' councils, and parent-teacher community associations. This is another major change. We had the suggestion, and we certainly acted on it, that given the important role of communities in schools, we expanded from parent-teacher to parent-teacher community associations to support and encourage that partnership between members of the community and their local schools. Part 7 is the National Code of Conduct, School Rules, and Discipline. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, we've included in the National Code of Conduct disciplinary responses to student misbehavior. We've outlined the conditions for suspensions. And in this part, we've added in-school suspensions as well as out-of-school suspensions. The process for search and seizure, and when a disciplinary decision is made, that parents and students have a right to appeal a disciplinary response. So there is a right to appeal described there as well. Part 8 deals with the rights and duties of educators, and this includes the rights and duties of principals, vice principals, teachers, and school counselors. They are spelled out in the draft act. Part 9 addresses the St. Lucia Island Scholarship, including the qualification and examination for the scholarship, the conditions under which the scholarship may be forfeited, the bonding of scholarship recipients, and the awarding of grants and bursaries to students aside from that island scholarship. Part 10 deals with appeals and the procedures of the Education Appeals Tribunal and the regulations for appeals as well. And Part 11 is miscellaneous. There are a whole bunch of different topics addressed there, everything from contagious diseases to closure of schools, loitering on school premises, etc. So a variety of topics are clustered in the miscellaneous section. Next slide, please. So we want to pause here. That's the bulk of the presentation, and we want to spend the time listening to you. So we encourage you to put a question or comment in the chat box or raise your hand. And we look forward to the discussion of your perspectives on the Draft Education Act and Regulations and any questions you may have. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Yes, SMC board, I can see. Go ahead, please. Please go ahead with your question, SMC board.
Apologies, I was muted. My apologies.
That's okay.
My pertains to the Education Bill, the 21st November, Section 45. I was just seeking clarification of Section 45, Part 3B. It states that in an agreement under this section, a private school agrees in writing for the premises to be jointly owned by the government and the proprietor. What does this mean exactly?
Monica, I think I can answer this one because I believe you've actually had a conversation with the Equip office about this. So we did a little bit of research and discussion before the meeting. Actually, 45.3 talks about a private school agrees in writing to receive public funds for certain things like the maintenance of a school, the provision of school equipment. So that is one way that an agreement can be reached for an assisted school to exist. C is a second way, because you can see at the end of 3.5, it says or. So in the case of an assisted school that is jointly owned by the government and the proprietor, that would be a different type of agreement. So there's an agreement that could be under A, an agreement that could be under B and C, and then an agreement under E. And it comes about because in some cases, there are physical facilities that are owned by the government, but actually are run as assisted schools by the proprietor. And so this 3B actually facilitates that type of arrangement, but does not prohibit a building being owned by a private group and entering into an agreement with the government for the operation of an assisted school.
Okay, so the way I understand, I think 3A is the status quo. Is that's your understanding also?
I don't believe in all cases. Or,
not in all cases, but in the case of an assisted school, I think 3A would be the status quo.
Well, it would be the case for many schools. Actually, we haven't polled all schools, but we do know that under the Act of 2005, it was possible for a facility to be owned by the government and the proprietor together, as is discussed in B, and then the management to be shared by the minister and the proprietor. But I think, based on our knowledge, the majority of the cases fall under A.
And I think you are correct. I was just seeking clarification on that.
Of course, understood. It could be interpreted that it is the expectation that all premises would be jointly owned by the government and the proprietor, but that is not the case, and that's why that or is so critical.
Okay. Got you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
For the question.
And there's a question, I think, also a question in the chat or a comment. I'm sorry, there we go.
Plausible is K3 in St. Lucia. Is that the question you're referencing?
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Mrs. Anthony. So the question is, how plausible is kindergarten through grade 3 in St. Lucia? That's an interesting question. I'm wondering if the person who posted it might want to expand on that.
Yes, I would.
Thank you.
Yes, my reason for asking that question, we do not have too many government daycares in St. Lucia. And I know that early childhood education costs a lot. So does the government have some, I don't know if you'll be able to answer that, but I am not sure that we are ready. Well, depending on how soon the act will be enacted, I'm not sure that we are ready for K3, compulsory education. I think the children will be disadvantaged. Some students will have those who can afford in a higher socioeconomic bracket will have proper K3 education, and those who are not able to. So then the teachers at the K level will be at a disadvantage. That's my reason for asking that question.
Excellent question. Dr. Williams, do you go ahead, Dr. Williams?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It is an excellent question. And it's a topic we've had some discussion about in terms of the timeline and the readiness for the early childhood education, and also the connection with kindergarten. So as we understand it, some schools already offer pre-kindergarten programs. So some are already underway. And this addition to the Act provides the leeway to offer pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds and also to expand out to offer early childhood education for 3-year-olds and up. There is a provision in the Act that the government can take some time to establish the early childhood education services. There is leeway in the Act because you're making a really important point. It would be very challenging to do all at once. So there is some time that can be set aside, that can be taken for the government to fully implement this aspect of the draft Act. So that question has come up before because it is a valid point.
But to not have it there would preclude it happening. Like, it wouldn't give support for it happening. So, and because the Act, right now we're reviewing an Act from 2005. So if you think that an Act might have a life of about 20 years, we want to be able to think about what is in the best interest of the children of St. Lucia moving forward and add pieces to the Act that are what we might consider aspirational now, but in 5 or 6 years may actually be exactly what is envisioned. And that's why these sorts of things have been included in the Act, but that but it provides the opportunity for the minister to make advances as resources are available.
And it's a really important point overall. We've tried to respond to the requests of St. Lucians and also to build extra capacity into this draft. So as Mrs. Cook McKinnon pointed out, there is the opportunity there and the capacity to expand into early childhood education. Something we haven't mentioned that we also added is that we heard from different persons that sometimes students are staying in secondary school 17, 18, 19 years old because they require more time to complete secondary school or because they are students with special needs. So in this draft, we've also added a provision at the other end for early childhood education for extended school attendance by youth who are aged 18 to 20 years. So we've tried to build capacity right across the age span and to give the government the leeway that when they want to act, whether it's alternative education for secondary school students or early childhood education, they have the backing of the Education Act to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. There is also another question in the chat. It said, "Can you please qualify Section 84 of the Education Bill?" And Section 84 refers to the wishes of a parent, and it says an educational leader shall respond in writing to a written request from a parent with respect to the wishes of the parent for the education of a student. Did you have a comment on that, Dr. Williams?
Well, that really speaks to, that goes back to the rights of parents, rights and responsibilities of parents. And in the current Act, it states that the wishes of parents shall be considered. And so now it's gone a step further, that there will be a response in writing when a parent makes a request about the education of their child. So, for example, if they made a request to the ministry, to a leader in the ministry, or to a principal, that they would get a response in writing with regard to what they're asking for. It doesn't necessarily mean that what they're asking for is going to be granted or that their wishes can be fulfilled, but that they will be considered and responded to.
Does that help with your question?
And Dr. Williams, may I say that the in writing is very significant here, because
yes.
in the past, parents would go in and they would have a conversation, but there would be no follow-up in writing. So I think that in writing is very, very important in that section now.
Yes, Mrs. Anthony, that is a step ahead for sure.
Please note, however, that it does say that the educational leader responds in writing to a written request from a parent, because we also know that quite often there are many requests that come verbally or just informally. So this is a written request with a written response.
I come in here again, Dr. Williams. It is a matter of effective communication. Most times, parents might come in or will come in, and it is now the duty of the principal as the second step to say, well, I have heard you, I have listened, could you kindly put it in writing so that I can then take action on it? And then the parent will respond to, I have received your letter of request for your wish. And this is the kind of flexibility or the kind of responsibility and accountability that the Act is now given, that let us do it and let us do it right. Does that make sense to you, Miss?
Yes. And I hope that adds clarification for the person who posed the question, because it is a really good question.
So there's another question in the chat. Additionally, will provisions be made in all communities so that all 3-year-olds can attend public school?
Thank you for the question. And I'm just looking at the Act with regard to that question, and I want to go back to something that was raised earlier. In Section 29, the stages of public education, early childhood is included. And so the intention is there that capacity will be built in early childhood. So the minister in Section 32 can authorize the alteration of existing types of education or the cessation, or authorize the provision of new types of education. So the minister really has the discretion as to when and how the early childhood education is expanded out to include more students. And that is stated in the Act. So I just wanted to provide that clarification. I don't know, Mrs. Cook-McKinnon or Mrs. Anthony, if you wanted to add further to that.
But the only thing I would say is that in conjunction, thank you for the specific reference to the sections. But so this, as we talked about earlier, this gives the minister the opportunity to expand as the resources of the country enable the minister to do so. So once again, we envision over time, yes, there will be provisions for all 3-year-olds, but it does depend on the ability of the country to make that possible.
And we've heard many questions about early childhood education, which is great to hear because it is such an important aspect of education. And one of the things that we're looking at doing in terms of the national curriculum is adding a section on early childhood education to the national curriculum, again, to provide support for movement toward providing more early childhood education for the children of St. Lucia. And I see, Mary, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Is there any provision in the Act that speaks to the government providing adequate support for persons for special education and for inclusive education to be provided efficiently at in the general ed schools?
So, starting with Section 53, thank you for the questions, an excellent question. Starting with Section 53 in the Draft Education Act, there is a section on special needs education and inclusive education. So they are addressed in the Act. I'd also point out that one of the rights of students, all students, including students with special needs, is the right to an appropriate education. So that speaks to what you're talking about, I think, with regard to providing appropriate programming and services for students, including those who have special needs. We talk about in this section of the Act and also in the regulations about accommodations, individual education plans. They are specifically referenced in the Act. They are often provided for children with special needs. And as I mentioned too, there is a new council on special needs education and inclusive education that has been added to the Act to provide leadership and advocacy for strengthening the education programs and services for students with special needs and to promote inclusive education. Another key feature we haven't referenced so far is that we're recommending that the education of children with special needs be provided in the least restrictive environment so that they can be educated in primary and secondary schools alongside their peers whenever possible. We recognize there will be some instances where students' needs are such that they require the programs and services in a special education school, but we are recommending in this draft that to the extent possible, the children with special needs be educated alongside their age peers in primary and secondary schools. We've also updated completely the categories of special needs and the language. We've expanded the categories. We've specifically referenced mental health challenges, for example, autism spectrum disorder, learning disabilities, and we've also included giftedness because students who are gifted require supports as well. And enrichment is an important form of accommodation that some students require, and that's now acknowledged in the Draft Act. Also, with regard to your question on inclusive education, from the very beginning of the Act, with the student-centered vision, we're talking about inclusive education and inclusive national curriculum that accommodates diverse students. We're emphasizing the move toward inclusive teaching practices and assessment practices throughout the Act as well. And so inclusion is something that is emphasized throughout the many different parts of the Draft Act and the regulations as well. Another excellent question. Thank you.
We have another question.
Okay.
Clarification on searching of students. Legally, only police have the power and authority to search.
So that is a topic that we examine very closely, and we should point out that another key member of our team is Miss Kim St. Rose, who is a former Attorney General of St. Lucia, and she is the lawyer on our team who has been looking at legal issues and doing the drafting of the Education Act and the regulations. With regard to search and seizure, one of the things that was looked at was the Constitution of St. Lucia. And it's important to note that the Education Act crosses over or intersects with many other laws in the country. For example, when we talk about the prohibition against selling alcohol on school premises, we had to make sure that what was in the Education Act is in alignment with the Liquor Control Act. When we think about students being absent from school or suspected abuse or neglect, we have to think about social services or community services legislation. We also looked at the alignment of the Act with the Constitution, and that included with under the Constitution how some of the different senior leaders are appointed, including the permanent secretary and the chief education officer. And to your point, we looked at the provisions for search in the Constitution, and in the drafting of the Act, in our discussions with Mrs. Kim St. Rose, care was taken that a balance was struck between protecting the rights of students as they're protected under the Constitution, but also protecting the rights of students and staff to be safe and secure at school. So there was a lot of discussion, and that's how the search and seizure provision was developed and added to the Act. I'm just going to go specifically to that provision so that we can specifically reference what is said. And it says here that the search and seizure under Section 170, that a principal, a vice principal, or teacher may search the person or property of a student under his or her control on reasonable suspicion that the student has an item that's prohibited, for example, drugs or illegal weapons. Or Part B, in the case of that student posing an imminent threat to the safety of the student or another person on school premises. So that really there has to be an imminent threat. It's not taken lightly. There are conditions around the search and seizure, and they are spelled out in Section 170 of the Act, and I encourage you to take a look there. These are excellent questions.
And we have another one in the chat. Can clarification be given on point 175C about educators' rights to access continuing education as may be prescribed? Does that mean that the educator is limited to only pursue courses prescribed by the Ministry of Education?
Access to continuing education as may be prescribed. I can say with absolute clarity that that was not the intent when that was being discussed. We were trying to put teacher access or educator access to continuing education as a right, and so we would not see it as being solely restricted to what is prescribed, because many educators like to take courses through universities or attend conferences on their own initiative. So we did envision a broader scope for that. And thank you for raising the point. I can see how that could be interpreted narrowly, and we will certainly revisit that as we're looking at the next round of adjustments to the draft. Thank you for raising that.
And I think there's another comment here. If a child is in special education at public school, what provision is in the Act whether or not this child moves up with his peers or is kept back?
Thank you for the question. Again, we're recommending that they be educated with their peers to the extent possible. There's nothing specific in the Act about the promotion or retention of students with special needs. Actually, there's nothing specific in the Act about the retention or promotion of any students. That's a decision that's left to the educators as to how the students are progressing through school.
And one more question. Oh, that was just a thank you.
Okay.
Is there, yes, go ahead.
Any other questions or comments on the draft Act? Mr. Filbert, go ahead, please, or Ms. Filbert, go ahead, please.
Good night to all. Thank you very much. I have posted, I have an issue with my voice. I avoided speaking, and I posted 1 or 2 questions in the chat, but I want to go back to the question 170 about search. I heard your response, but I still have a discomfort or maybe some kind of cognitive dissonance in understanding the power, the authority. I heard what you said, And I heard what he said about safety. But as far as I know, unless there are going to be some changes where persons, educators, only the police can actually search, and I understand everything about safety. So I think for this section 170 to work, I think there must be some set of guidelines to go with explain how this search and seizure is going to work out or is supposed to be implemented. Because I know in the past we have asked the students to empty out your pockets or empty out your bags, but we cannot search them or pat them down. So the way this is written there, I interpret that just as how a police would search, and even for the police to search, they need a warrant. So I think to avoid any further complication, we need to have specific guidelines as to how 170 is going to work out, so that we as educators can be so guided, and we are going to implement that the way it ought to be implemented without compromising the safety of anybody, including the educator and the other persons on compound. That's one. My other comment that I have not raised is that I want to applaud the work for inclusion of the rights, responsibilities of the education officers, because for far too long we are left to interpret as to what we think that the duties and responsibilities were. And now that it is included, I think it is a step in the right direction, and there'll be further clarity. And this section will help us to work better with our EOs to ensure that they also function to the maximum. I was looking for a section I read earlier on, my third point, to do with the code of conduct, I think it is called. And that section has something on the dress code, but I cannot find it and I cannot remember it clearly. But I think from what I vaguely remember, there was some need for clarity in terms of that aspect of the code of conduct. And my final point, I want to go back to the 3-year-olds. And though your response was the minister will decide, which of course is true, but let's assume the act comes into effect, say February 1st for argument's sake, and then it spells out that all 3-year-olds shall, because I think I saw the word shall, attend school, and there isn't any provision in a particular community, maybe especially a disadvantaged community, and the parent is unable to pay for private schooling for his or her 3-year-old, would that parent in that situation commit an offense? So I think these are my, these are my key questions for now. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. And I've been jotting down notes, so I hope I don't miss any of your questions. They're excellent points. Thank you for raising them. When you're talking about guidelines and search and seizure, that raises a really important point that we haven't discussed yet this evening. And that's the fact that many of the issues that are raised in the Education Act and the regulations could certainly benefit from supporting policies, search and seizure being an example. And I know in the area of special education, there's currently work underway in St. Lucia drafting a special education and inclusive education policy. So the Education Act provides the legal framework for the education system and how it operates, but policies are really important as well. And certainly it would be the case that if these new provisions in the Education Act and the regulations are adopted, there would be the need for supporting policies in several areas. Your
Excuse me, though. Sorry. Oh, go ahead. The regulations and code of conduct, though, do add more detail to this. Am I not correct?
Not on search and seizure, but I was just going to speak to the national code.
Thank you.
Because, with regard to your question on the national code, there is greater detail found in the regulations, including Schedule 8 on the National Code of Conduct. And you mentioned the standard for appropriate dress. So we had a tremendous amount of discussion and, frankly, debate from different persons, different opinions as to how the issue of school dress should be handled. And so after looking at different options and a lot of different opinions put forward, we decided to go with a positive approach of describing appropriate school dress and the benefits of it, giving examples of appropriate dress for school staff, and also describing inappropriate school dress, examples of that for persons in the school, and using that as the frame for addressing issues around school uniforms, the dress of staff, etc. This, again, I cannot overemphasize, this was a very thorny issue and a lot of very different opinions about how it should be handled. So we took that positive route, and it is spelled out in the National Code of Conduct in the regulations. With regard to the 3-year-olds, are the parents committing an offense? It's when we talk about school attendance, there are duties of parents to make sure that their child attends school. But again, as we've been speaking to this evening, we recognize it's going to take time for capacity to be built for early childhood education. And so there is that provision in the Act for the minister to have the leeway. So it's not the intent that as this Act goes forward, I want to emphasize as well on that point that we will prepare another draft and a report to go to the government, and it's up to the government whether they decide to proceed with an updated Education Act or not. If that happens and the Education Act is updated and enacted, again, because there is a provision that the minister can take some time and make decisions about when these forms of education are rolled out. And also there's a provision in the Act about the availability of resources. It's not the intent that immediately on day one, people would be guilty of an offense as you framed it. It's the intent that there has to be a look at the resources available and the time required, but the capacity is there to expand early childhood education. I don't know, Paula or Fortuna, if you wanted to add anything to that.
The only thing I will add to that, thank you, Dr. Williams, is that I think the government is painfully aware of that, and they have begun creating much needed access to early childhood education. As Ms. Filbert will be aware, schools where there are low enrollment, you have pre-Ks being developed, and government is also building, with the support from CDB, a number of government-owned preschools where the fees, some children, some families, there'll be specific criteria. Some families might not have to pay so that the children will access early childhood education. So I think the Act is just moving ahead because it has to be futuristic, and things will happen when it comes to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. McKinnon, did you want to add anything further?
No, I think that's great. Thank you. There was a question in the chat about the draft code of conduct where you can access it, and Ms. Emmanuel just posted the link to the site where both the proposed, the draft, I shall say, draft bill and the draft regulations are available to you so that you can have a good look at it.
And I see Makout secondary. If I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize, but please go ahead.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Madam. Monica Williams, I guess that's all I see your name as. Yes. I'm J.D. Roses. I'm at Makout Secondary Center right now. All right. I would have read about this meeting and heard a few things about it. So I have a number of questions. I don't know if they could be accommodated. I would like them to be accommodated because that's something that I'm very concerned with what's happening right now. figuring that this is the whole reason for having such a meeting. Okay, first of all, with us having this meeting now, is it actually to discuss a draft that has been put forward by the ministry? That's one of my first questions, and the question is not finished yet. Or is it something that was proposed by a group of people and then brought forward to us as what should be done or what will be done with students and teachers in the upcoming years? That's my first question.
May I respond to that one right now? So by all means, please pose all your questions. We encourage that, and we will respond. As I pointed out earlier on, the Department of Education in St. Lucia contracted with Mindbloom Consulting and St. Francis Xavier University to partner with the educators in St. Lucia, to work with the ministry, to work with the citizens of St. Lucia in the development of proposed enhancements to the Education Act and regulations. So the ministry contracted to have it developed. We've worked in partnership with them, and this is where the draft has come from. And also, as I mentioned earlier as well, sir, based on extensive consultations with St. Lucians and also ongoing responses to the input of St. Lucians about what they want in their act. This is the St. Lucia Education Act for St. Lucians, and we're really making every effort we can to make sure that the work that's being done reflects their wishes, reflects their requests, addresses their concerns, and that's the process that's been followed.
And just to add to that, it is not really something for next year. I mean, obviously, it's going to go through an approval process. What we're doing right now is conducting numerous town hall meetings so that people can look at a draft and consider what adjustments would be appropriate. This is actually the second draft that we have done. And as Dr. Williams mentioned at the opening, we received over 700 comments on what could be done to the first draft that we developed, and in response to that, extensive changes were made. And what you're seeing is the result of the changes that were made after the last consultation. It does go through an approval process, and when Parliament actually determines that it is suitable for approval, that is when it goes into effect. And obviously, it is entirely up to the leaders of St. Lucia when that occurs.
Okay, you said that it is up. Well, you've said a number of things. Both you, that would be Miss Paula Cook McKinnon, and Miss Monica Williams. So, since you all are the consultants, I'm throwing my questions at you. So first of all, you said that it's entirely up to the leaders to make that decision. So on the timing as to when the decision would be finalized.
That's what I said, yes.
All right. So the actual decision, with you having mentioned that you got 700 comments, that 700 comments would be 700 out of a much larger number. All right. So that is like a very small fraction of those who are actually going to be affected by such an act. Right.
But those were the persons who determined that they wanted to respond to the draft. And those, I mean, we can't make people respond. So we take the responses that we get and the representations that we receive.
Okay, and that is what I am concerned with. I am very concerned with this, right? Because if the government is going to make a responsible decision, the decision would have to go through numerous schools so that the ideas and so that the heart of the people could actually be expressed, and not just those who, all right, I happen to be here, so I make a comment. Rather, it could be strategic so that you get majority representation, maybe not 100%, because usually that's impossible. But you could be strategic in getting majority representation so that the heart of the people are represented, and not just because the consultation was carried out and the effort was made by the consultation and they brought back because like 1,000 people in St. Lucia responded. So that's what we found. So that is what we are presenting, having 1,000 presented the idea. I think with such a thing, which is so sensitive, law is very sensitive, right? And when this thing goes into action, it can move a landslide in the positive direction or in the negative direction. So I think that whoever is going to, the stakeholders and whoever was contracted to do whatever, should do everything in their power to get the represented ideas and heart of the people so that the decision can actually represent St. Lucia and not just, we did our job, the rest is left up to you. So because you guys are
with all due respect, that's exactly what we're trying to do right now. So these town hall meetings have been widely publicized, and and those who have organized it in St. Lucia have actually gone to great lengths to make it possible for people who do not have electronic access to attend in centers throughout St. Lucia. So they've opened up facilities so that persons can go and hear and talk. And we are having additional discussions with educators moving beyond this. So I do say, sir, that we are trying very hard to get as much input as we can from throughout St. Lucia to do exactly what you wish to have happen.
Okay, I would like to disagree with you. You may want to say that it's my opinion, all right? But I would not say that the efforts, for example, the electronic meeting, I think it's very ineffective. The electronic meeting is ineffective because, and the timing that we are having this meeting, and that is what I meant. And I wanted to open the can of worms so that the reality is expressed. Because a lot of times I think, and based on talking from what I have seen in my few years, that this is said, but this is not what is actually done. So the consultancy actually takes place as that is happening right now, because that is part of the consultancy process, right? So it's actually taking place. But usually when it takes place, you don't have proper representation, meaning, for example, this draft possibly can come off by the end of December, January. I'm just suggesting. And then this meeting is taking place in December. This would be the first meeting with what is possible, the populace, right? What we might call the populace.
Can I come in here a minute? Dr. Williams, I am hearing the gentleman, but I think the gentleman probably has missed out
on a number of things.
We are not just consulting today.
General population.
Hold on a minute, please, sir. Hold on a minute. When the consultancy was advertised and awarded, we went through a process, okay? Groups and groups and groups, from school children to parents to special need parents, will come in and speaking and were engaged. We heard them, and then they had the free will. They were writing in and sending their thoughts in writing. We took the time to filter. We met with parents, we met with students, we met with NGOs, we met with business places, we met with teachers, we met with principals, we met with, whoever formed a significant part of the population of St. Lucia. I remember there was a gentleman, I think he must have been one of the few that came to a meeting and spoke at length about his child and special education. We listened. So it is not a thing that is just, we are not just consulting. We have heard, we have taken time, we have filtered, we have written one draft, we have sent it in the Ministry of Education, and the team looks at it. We have come back, and what we are doing now is coming right back to the same groups of persons who, some persons were there, some persons were not there, and we have taken through the Ministry of Education to publicize. It's on the radio, it's on the television. You know, we have made the provision through the ministry, the equip section. We know not everybody has internet, etc., etc. So centers have been set up, and we invite everybody. We were not selecting everybody. Come and talk, come and hear, and share your thoughts. So this is not a one-shot thing. And the consultants, we are not just putting our thoughts on paper. We have done research about what is happening in the region for education, what is happening internationally, and we want the best. So when we say we are hearing from people again, we are looking to produce a document which puts the education system of St. Lucia in the forefront, and it is futuristic. We have, for the first time, you will, if you read, if you download, because the documents were put there, there's no secret to the education, the draft education bill that we have there. It's not an act as yet, it is a bill. We put it there, anybody could download it and read it. And for the first, St. Lucia will have regulations to guide. You heard Dr. Williams said, even if there are regulations, there are some things that will require policy if you are to action it, because it is the implementation of things. You said it yourself. Things might be said and things might be written, but we are saying, we are asking you, what are your thoughts? So we are consulting, and we want you to validate what was said. We made changes, and we are asking you again to validate. Is that what you think is needed in the Education Act? So please remember, we didn't come yesterday and asking you to make a decision today. It didn't work like that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Miss, I would like to respond to you. All right. What I want to say is that this is the first that has come across to the schools, and that is why I'm expressing a concern. This is the first time that schools have been engaged. This is the first time that schools have been engaged like this, at least electronically. Although I'm in disagreement to the electronic group, to the electronic meeting, I'm thinking that what we should have done, what should have happened is that we should have been engaged possibly through our union and so on. Because, and I'm saying I am concerned because of the things that I see of possible changes in the acts or in the rights of teachers, if I could put it that way. Maybe my legal jargon is not precise. And because, as I said, a major thing, it's a concern both on the changes that may be coming for students as well as the changes that are coming for teachers. For example, let me just highlight a very glaring one about 5 being subtracted from the 11 that were previously there. And how could such a suggestion be made? And we were not previously told of it. And it's only now that we were told that the meeting is going to take place. And then we were made aware of that change. If that happened a number of years ago or a number of months ago, this is the first that we are hearing of it. So
well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful that you're hearing about it, because there's time to change it. We want your input. So if you feel that I do know why some things have been removed, because they're a right for everyone, not just for educators. So there are explanations, but we are very open to suggesting that things be changed in a very positive way to ensure that everyone feels that the Act reflects their vision for education in St. Lucia. So we're grateful to you for coming this evening. And if there are specific things within the Act that you take issue with, we are here to hear them and to respond to them.
Well, this is what I'm saying. There are a number of them, and my colleagues have expressed them. I am expressing them as well. There are a number of them, and because I am ignorant as to when the decisions that are going to be made from this meeting, coming out of this meeting, I am concerned. So is a timeline going to be given to us so that negotiations can actually happen? Because the negotiations actually have to happen with the people of the country and not
Excuse me, sir. Let me ask you a specific question. Are you a teacher?
Yes, I am, madam.
Okay. Now, the teachers' union.
Yes.
I think the teachers' union, we give an extensive period of time to the teachers' union to meet with us, to discuss with us. I think what we are recognizing is that the teachers' union has not probably covered everybody. I remember I came to the conference. I do not know if you were at the conference, and Mr. Howell wanted specifically to have some clarity on the code and the regulations. We are given another opportunity, because we have heard from the first 4 district meetings that we have had, that some principals want some more time to ask some questions. So the Ministry of Education has asked, and the team, we have consented, because we understand that this act is about teachers, children, and everybody in St. Lucia who has an interest in education, whether you have a child or not. So on Friday, there'll be a meeting with principals. All principals should be there, but as you know, we cannot force anybody to attend a meeting. Yes, you would have liked a virtual meeting, but unfortunately, 2 of the consultants are based in Canada. And then we are going to meet through Equip Asking Again, and the team consenting that we will meet with all teachers who wish to ask questions, who wish to have clarity. We'll be meeting with them again Friday the 8th at 3 p.m. So I would say
1:30.
1:30.
Sorry, 2:30. I'm sorry, 2:30. Things were changing today. The request came in today, but I believe now we have settled on 2:30 on Friday.
2:30 on Friday. So I would say to you, sir, if you have not had a chance to download the draft bill and the regulations, please do so and take a little time, go through it, and probably come on Friday. Or we are very open to receiving all your written queries, because as Dr. Williams said, we would wish other persons present to have an opportunity to ask the question. So you can put yours in writing, send it to equip, I think it's to Edith, and Edith sends it right across to Dr. McKinnon, and we just act on it, So if you don't mind, I know you said you have a lot of questions. If you could, if this is acceptable to you, go through them, write as many questions, and we will address it, and join us again on Friday. We are using the same link, if you don't mind. Yes?
You said Friday the 5th, madam.
8th, sir. Friday the 8th.
Right.
Friday the 8th.
All right.
Yes. So you can join us on Friday the 8th. And even if you join us on Friday and you have more questions for clarity, you could feel free to just share with us, so that, because we want the best.
Yes,
because
I have a lot of questions.
remember, when a bill becomes an act, you do not change an act every year or every 2 years.
That's what I know.
Since 2005 that we had a review. We had no regulations. Okay? Now we have come, so we are reviewing. So we appreciate your concerns, but at this point in time, if you don't mind, I do not know whether you'll send in your questions, whether you'll join us on Friday, but if you don't mind, what would you like to do?
The truth is, I do mind because, like I said, this is very sensitive, and there's a lot that I want answered. There's a lot of engagement that I want, because I think that is what has to happen for something proper to come through, and not only on my part, but all the others who are supposed to be participating in this discussion, like many others which are supposed to happen before things are presented and then enacted. So
we understand your point, sir.
We understand that, and we definitely agree that.
But I understand that we are working within a limited time. So that is about the only reason I will give in and say I'm going to stop here. But at the same time, I want to suggest more of that happening, because this is my first opportunity, I can say fair opportunity, to have a discussion, because I was never given that opportunity per se from a school standpoint.
Excuse me, I just have a question. No one has given you the opportunity. You were not aware until this week that the Education Act was being reviewed?
With the people that are actually going to help make the decisions, like, for example, the consultants and whoever contracted them. And I'm thinking that this is who we are interacting with right now. That's what I mean.
And so you were never approached by any other organization to have input?
Yes, the teachers at my school, for example, who represent me at the union, and told me of it, about that. My principal made mention of it. So I was engaged like this, but that's about it. When you are engaged like this, that's about as much as you could just express your idea, but not necessarily express the idea to know that it would actually be taken seriously, so that it can have some impact on the decisions that actually are going to be made.
If I could,
I just have to assure,
please. If I could respond, I just want to make a couple of points, listening to the conversation going back and forth. First of all, sir, very respectfully, you said whoever contracted with the consultants, and we've made it explicitly clear it was the Department of Education in St. Lucia that contracted with St. FX University and with Mindbloom Consulting to review the Education Act. It wasn't whoever, it was the Department of Education, and we're working in partnership with them. The second point I would raise with regard to engagement is that, again, as we've clearly communicated tonight, we have been engaged in consultations with St. Lucians since February 2022. And as Mrs. Anthony so articulately described it, we have engaged with multiple groups, parents, students, teachers, advocacy groups, with the Office of the Attorney General, with the St. Lucia Teachers Union and the National Principals Association. And what you're seeing here tonight is not a last-minute attempt to say that we consulted, if that's the implication. What you see here tonight is a result of 2 years of consultation and research and discussion with St. Lucians, and taking their input very seriously and giving it every consideration and respect in developing the most recent draft that we are discussing in the town hall meetings. This is not just beginning to consult. This is ongoing consultation, and the input of St. Lucians has been collected, analyzed, themes have been identified, and we've been providing ongoing updates. There's been open and clear communication. We produced an interim report to inform the department of the work that has been done to date. We've kept a record of the input that we received from all these various sources and the actions that have been taken. We have shared that information. And I would point out that we have been very responsive to various groups. For example, one of the suggestions from the St. Lucia Teachers Union was that they very much were in support of having regulations, that some regulations had been drafted back, I believe, in the late 1990s, and they thought they would be a good starting ground for developing regulations. And that is exactly what we have done. So it's not the case that this is coming out of the blue, or that people have not been given an opportunity to speak, or that what they've spoken has not been heard. It's an ongoing consultative, collaborative process, and we are making every effort. And I also want to state explicitly, we are acting in good faith. We are, as Mrs. Anthony pointed out, attempting to provide the very best product we can, to recommend the enhancements to the Education Act that are grounded in the input of St. Lucians and their desires for their education system, and also grounded in contemporary research for best practices. So this is not a last minute thing. This has been building for almost 2 years now to bring us to the point that we're at tonight. And we are here asking for questions and comments as a continuation of that consultation process that's been ongoing over the 2-year period. Thank you.
So I think, given the late, but I think actually we should probably move on, given the lateness of the hour. I know that there are several messages in the chat box. So, Mrs. Anthony, are you okay if we move on?
Could I just answer to just assure teacher that the time frame, he was asking for a time frame. I am sure we explained there's a process, and final decisions do not lie with us, the consultants. The government of St. Lucia, the Minister of Education, when he receives the final draft, the Attorney General has to be involved. Then it goes through the process. If there's needs for changes, et cetera, that will be done. So it is not the consultants that will say to the government of St. Lucia or give them a time frame. Thank you.
Thank you. So there is a question in the chat that I apologize in advance if this question was asked before. I noticed that there are only 5 rights of an educator compared to the 11 from the previous previous act. My question is, why were the others removed, especially the one that says that every teacher has a right to be treated in a fair and reasonable manner? Dr. Williams, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And this question has come up previously in town hall meetings. It's something that we've noted. We did attempt to consolidate the rights for all educators, including school counselors, vice principals, principals, and teachers. Before we've had discussion about having them separately, and we tried to bring them together. But we certainly recognize there are concerns from teachers about the reduction in the number of rights, and we're looking at that. And we're very appreciative of having people flag that as an issue. So it's something that we're looking at, and thank you again for raising it.
And there's also a question about what comes next after this consultation. Will a working document be made available to, I'm sorry, it's just jumping around on me, made available to include the changes? What I can say is that the Education Act and any bill that goes before Parliament, based on my understanding, it's a public document. So this whole process is a public process, and while we are the consultants and we don't make the decisions, we make recommendations, it would be our understanding that anything that advances would be obviously a very public part of a public process. This is your Education Act, and so you would definitely have a chance before it becomes an act, while it's still a bill, to have input. And then, of course, your representatives in Parliament and your representatives in Cabinet would also have an opportunity to have input, and they're your elected officials. So we believe that there is still opportunity, and that you can be as involved as you would likely be. That you could be as involved as you would like to be in the process moving forward. Oh, go ahead, Monica. Sure.
Yes, and we do have a slide here in answer to these questions about what happens next. We do have a slide later on, just a few slides ahead, that says next steps, that describes what's going to happen. So we will go over that then too.
Okay. And there is also a comment in okay, so this person says the teachers who were present at the education conference of the St. Lucia Teachers Union in October were hearing this for the very first time. I'm assuming that means in October. And Mrs. Anthony kept insisting that invitations had been sent out for consulting with teachers. Unfortunately, and I'm sorry, it just jumped on me. I will go back. Unfortunately, that never reached the teachers because no one at the conference was aware of those previous consultations. Right. Not sure who dropped the ball, but this is what happens. Well, we are here where we are now. And if a ball was dropped somewhere before, I think every effort is being made to involve everyone, including teachers, and obviously the dialogue from this evening. I hope you will see from the dialogue this evening that we are encouraging and receptive to input and are looking forward to the ongoing discussion that we will have in the upcoming sessions.
May I? May I?
Sure. Yes.
This is the same gentleman.
Yes. What's your name, please?
J.D. Roses.
Okay. Thank you.
That's my name.
Yes.
And I'm thankful to the participant who put that comment in. And that is why the concern, it's just like a piece of evidence as to why this touchy-feely about it. Okay? For reasons. And that is one of the reasons. When you are being told, because as a teacher at a school, if this is something that has been happening for the past 2 years, we would have received documentation on stuff that was previously done. And that is why I was insisting that this is the first time, not because it's the first time that I heard of it, but when you are engaged so that the engagement becomes useful, that is what I actually call engagement. Not having heard it from the mouth of a colleague of mine. Hey, do you know such and such is about to happen? Do you know that the government, of course, we know that this generally happens where information is just transferred from one person to another by word of mouth, but that information has no weight per se in terms of decision making. So I heard of it, but this is actually the first effort that I recognize as a teacher as being done to help in the decision making. And I don't think enough was done in the 2 years that this thing has been going on to inform sufficient people. Because to me, like I said, it's my opinion, and with reason, it seems as if we have been engaged for just about 2 months of those 2 years. And it's actually less than 2 months.
So I can assure you that we have talked with teachers long before the last 2 months. I know that from our records. I'm sorry that perhaps you were interested and you weren't aware, and we're trying to rectify that now. There's another question. There was a question also about, and I think, Dr. Williams, when you responded to the question about the reduction in the rights, there was a question also about the right to be compensated for injury on the job. Did you wish to respond to that, Dr. Williams?
I just add further that we're reviewing, we're revisiting the rights of teachers based on the input. So yes, we're looking at all of them. Thank you.
And I think what we will be able to do is if there are less, well, there are less now, and if there is something that we don't add back in, we can explain why. And most often it was, I know in other sections of the Act, most often it was because it was covered in other legislation, and we were very careful to honor the other legislation that exists and not impose from the Education Act into other areas. There's another question here. I have noticed that the new regulations authorize educations to conduct searches on students. If the right to have legal and psychological support and to work free from molestation and abuse, etc., has been removed from the Act, who or what, oh, I'm sorry, it jumped again. Who or what will support or protect a teacher who conducts a search that is met with physical resistance and fight back from a student?
Thank you for the question. And I'm making notes as we go here. So again, this goes back to the question that was raised earlier about guidelines around search and seizure. So I'm noting that with regard to policy. But I also want to point out that in the National Code of Conduct, it's very explicit in the regulations in spelling out behavior that is not permissible, that is not condoned. And what you're describing there around physical assault or verbal abuse, etc., physical violence, for example, in the regulations, in the different types of behavior that are prohibited, physical violence is certainly spelled out. Disruptive behavior is spelled out. Insubordination toward teacher and principals is spelled out. So we have certainly made every effort to, verbal abuse is spelled out, to highlight what is not acceptable in terms of conduct, and whether it's during a search and seizure or at any other time. And also, as I said, there's a standard for behavior, but we've also been very detailed in addressing what is not acceptable behavior. But with regard to search and seizure specifically, again, we're recording everything, and we will bring that to our legal counsel, Mrs. St. Rose, for consideration. Thank you for raising it. These are excellent questions, and this is a very complex matter. Again, striking that balance between protecting safety and security and protecting the rights of students. So again, thank you so much for the feedback.
And there is another question about reasonable force. And so I think what we can do is indicate in our feedback in terms around the search and seizure piece, what I think there is actually we did have a discussion about reasonable force, I do believe, Dr. Williams, and I think there is actually a description about what is reasonable force available. I'm not sure it's in this act, but in other legislation. Is that correct?
We had discussion around defining reasonable force. Yes, that's an ongoing discussion with Mrs. St. Rose.
Right. So there's ongoing. I think we've got all of the questions about the searching of students. If not, please let me know. There was also a question about the composition of the consulting team, and the consultants, while we have several consultants on our team who are subject experts in government legislation, and that sort of, and education, the 4 consultants who have made the greatest contribution to this work are Ms. Kim St. Rose, who is a St. Lucian with expertise in the law. Obviously, she's a lawyer, and in drafting. Mrs. Anthony, who is a St. Lucian and former Chief Education Officer. Dr. Monica Williams, who is a specialist in leadership and governance from St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, and myself, Paula McKinnon, who is the principal of Mind Bloom Consulting, and have been involved in educational governance for over 20 years. So I think that we have endeavored to ensure that there is important membership on our team from St. Lucia so that we can understand as best we can the context of St. Lucia, and certainly the persons from St. Lucia on our team have provided excellent counsel. And then, of course, we have consulted widely to get a better understanding of the issues that could perhaps be addressed in new legislation. There is also a question about the meeting time for Friday at 2:30. That is, it says, for something as important as the Education Act, I think better consideration should be given to the time of the meeting with teachers. It is slated for 2:30 on Friday afternoon, as opposed to earlier in the day when it may be more convenient for most, time being given to attend. And I believe that 2:30 was selected to sort of give a balance between instructional time and time to consult. It wasn't that the time was not selected by us, but I think that's something that you may wish to speak if you think that a better time would be helpful. I think you should speak with your principal or Education Act in that regard. And then there's another question. The old act spoke directly to allowing teachers the right to participate in union activities, but this new bill does not. The words "and to participate in the lawful activities of the representative body or of which the teacher is a member" has been removed. Why were words removed, and can these words please be replaced? Thank you so much for that. That is one of the things that we will be looking at, and we have made note of that. And you can rest assured that we will look definitely at that piece. So those were the items that are in the chat, and I see no hands raised. So Dr. Williams, did you want to proceed?
Yes, let's go to the regulations, and then we'll pause again to see if there are any questions or comments.
Sorry, I just, there we go.
Thank you. So this is a one-page snapshot of the draft regulations, and it's been mentioned a couple of times that if regulations are adopted with an updated Education Act, they would be the first education regulations to come into force in St. Lucia. And while the Education Act provides a legal framework, the regulations are really important because they describe the procedures for putting the Education Act into practice, for implementing it. They provide guidance for interpretation of the Act and for implementation. The first section of the draft regulations contains the interpretation section with some definitions and a citation linking them directly to the Education Act. Part 1 is the administration of schools, and here detail is provided about the parameters of the school year. For example, how many days are in the school year, when the school year begins and ends, the length of the school day, the length of school vacations, the construction of school timetables, the student admission process, the school registers that have to be kept, textbooks, student assessments, and zoning. And I want to point out that one of the things we heard from many educators was that they did not feel they had enough time to cover the curriculum, to fully teach the curriculum, that there were many disruptions to the school day. So we have emphasized, based on that input, in this section of the regulations, the protection of teaching time for teachers. So that has been included in this section. Part 2 deals with the national curriculum, which is aligned with the National Qualifications Framework. In this section, there is an elaboration on the subjects offered in primary and secondary school, the components of the curriculum. And as mentioned earlier, we are looking at also adding a piece on early childhood education based on the feedback we've received so far in the town hall meetings. Part 3 deals with the management of schools, and we've addressed many different kinds of schools. Public, assisted, private, denominational schools are addressed. And we've also provided more structure and guidance around homeschooling, including a process for approving homeschooling programs, linking homeschooling to the national curriculum, and provision for inspections of homeschooling programs. And actually, speaking of inspections, this was another area where people requested more structure and detail. So in Schedule 7 of the regulations, we provided a list of matters to be addressed during visits and inspections. Part 4 addresses councils and associations, including the Students' Council, the National Students' Council, the national representative body, parent-teacher community associations, and the National Council of Parent-Teacher Community Associations. Again, emphasizing partnership and collaboration in the education sector. Part 5, and also in Schedule 8 in the regulations, provides a detailed overview of the proposed National Code of Conduct, including the guiding principles, the standards of behavior, the standard for appropriate dress, categories of misbehavior, acceptable and unacceptable responses to behavior, and the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved, including students, teachers, principals, the Ministry of Education, and community members. Very much the National Code of Conduct is geared toward positive, respectful behavior by all members of school community and the promotion of safety and security at school. Part 6 deals with discipline, in particular disciplinary complaints. So if complaints are made, it describes procedure for hearings, the responses by the Chief Education Officer, and the results of disciplinary hearings. Part 7 describes the Education Appeals Tribunal, including the process for appeal, how the hearing is held, decision and costs. And Part 8 deals with miscellaneous topics, including different schedules and forms. So, for example, you will find in this part an application form for a permit to operate a private school. There's also some discussion around fees, and there are other components of the regulations that we're still awaiting finalization of. So they will be built out even more once we get additional information. Next slide, please. Just going to pause here for any questions or comments about the draft regulations. Anything that you were wondering about or you wanted to share?
There's a question in the chat, and it says special education was not mentioned in the regulations. Would that be guided by the Special Education Council?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the section in the Act on Special Education has been expanded, and the Council will provide guidance in this area. That's one of the functions of the Council.
And I think, Dr. Williams, also in terms of the regulations, when it talks about responses to misbehavior, there are guidelines there to tailor responses to unique students. So it's a much more inclusive approach to responding to students. Is that not correct?
That is correct. The response to student misbehavior has to be appropriate, and we spell that out in the National Code of Conduct. Appropriate means that the response to the misbehavior is tailored to the student's age, if whether or not they have any special needs, and the circumstances. So that is an issue that is addressed explicitly in the National Code.
Thank you. And so, there's a hand up, please. SMC board.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hey, Jen. Well, this one is not. I looked at the in terms of the draft regulations. You're stating that you've expanded like the school age, or recommended expansion of the school age from the current 5 to 15 to 3 to 17. I was just wondering, when you look at like James Heckman, the Nobel laureate from University of Chicago, and he was outlining that the optimum return on investment is when you engage the child even earlier than 3 years old. And essentially, they become self-regulating. In other words, they'll stay in school longer, they'll stay away from crime, etc. Since the government has to spend more money in terms of expand the compulsory age to 17. And I'm not talking about compulsory age going below 3, but I was wondering if there was any discussion around a greater focus on engaging the child with quality childcare prior to 3 years old, considering that we are dealing with an economy which is service oriented. So I'm just looking at James Heckman's work. Quite impressive with, and he has supported this argument to the return investment be optimum prior to 3 years old. Was any consideration given to that? And the reason for I'm asking now is owing to the fact that we outlined that a bill will last 20 years approximately. So I think that St. Lucia is ready for that now. We are a service-oriented economy, and all women do not have access to quality early childhood education or quality childcare. So I was just wondering whether any consideration was given to that, whether that was discussed at all.
Thank you very much for the question. And certainly early childhood education from birth onward, and it's defined variously. Some define it birth to 5 years. Some in the literature say birth to 8 years. Some say birth to 12 years. We did certainly discuss that at length and the importance of having supportive early childhood education that's available and affordable. And when we expanded the school age, that was compulsory school age, as you pointed out, for 3 to 17 years. But that doesn't preclude, the provision of quality childcare and early childhood education from birth up to 3 years. We had the discussion. We settled on 3 to 5 to start. And one of the reasons that we did that, as has been mentioned, is some schools are already offering pre-kindergarten programs for 4-year-olds and some early childhood education. And we hit upon that number. But I'm going to ask Fortuna and Paula if they wanted to comment further on that.
Well, certainly, while the literature does support early childhood education at an earlier age, we did need to distinguish the child care from education. This is an Education Act, and actually jurisdictions have just recently introduced affordable childcare through separate initiatives outside of the Education Act. So we thought that moving to 3 was an excellent move from 5, and so supported that in terms of the vision that was shared with us by St. Lucian's, and the matter of child care probably would be best served through a different type of legislation that provided for that care.
Thank you, Paula. And again, thank you for the question.
Excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Oh, yes, go ahead. SMC board.
A final question from me. So you outlined in terms of non-discrimination owing to gender, and I was wondering whether the consultants are going to have some definition of that, or whether you're going to leave it up to our government to decide relative to gender issues. So, we've been following, of course, what has transpired in the United States, and we are aware, in terms of the tremendous social debate that occurs that surrounds issues of gender. And so we're just wondering whether you will make a specific recommendation, or you're going to leave it up to the government, our government, to decide on issues of gender, etc. I mean, I could go into more detail, but I think you get where I'm coming from.
Yes. Thank you for the question, and it is a complex topic. I would point out to begin with that in our discussions about gender, what we were mainly hearing about was protection against discrimination on the basis of gender. For example, that girls wouldn't be prevented from enrolling in science classes or advanced math classes, that they could participate in them and access that programming. But you're raising an important point. There are many other facets to gender. And one of the things that Mrs. McKinnon highlighted earlier is that we make recommendations, but the government makes the decisions. And so it will be at the discretion of the government as to how that issue is handled. And there are many different facets of it. Another related point that came up was legal name, what name is recorded in a school record. So there are many different facets that will have to be addressed.
And I do believe in our discussions, we also, it was also indicated to us that some of this actually may flow over into the Constitution as well. So it probably actually extends beyond Education Act work and extends into the Constitution.
Right.
And I know I promised this was the last question, but just from an extension of your answer. Have you considered the fact that in St. Lucia we have a few schools that are reserved for specific genders, as we currently define it, I guess. So we have an all-boys school, we have a few all-boys schools, we have a couple of girls schools. Has that been considered? Because when you look at the notion or the idea of having some governing rules that pertains to all children going to school, when there are different interactions at certain schools, some teachers may have different experiences trying to manage an all-boys school versus an all-girls school. I was just wondering whether that was given any consideration, the uniqueness of our experience here in St. Lucia. Yeah, and I don't think you'll have anything relative to in St. Lucia of girls being prevented from entering math class or science class, because the ladies graduate into the university in the Caribbean at a higher rate than guys. I mean, I'm just wondering, have you considered our unique experiences here in St. Lucia? Has that been considered?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, on a number of fronts. Certainly, again, this is your Education Act, and the context, the unique context of St. Lucia has been taken into account. It's at the forefront. And to repeat, we've emphasized upholding the cultures, the languages, the histories, the peoples of St. Lucia, and making the national curriculum, as an example, a curriculum for St. Lucia unique to your society, and that it has to be tailored that way. With regard to have we considered the unique context in terms of the different schools, one of the ways we've addressed that is in the Act and the regulations addressing denominational schools, which you've mentioned as all boys or all girls schools, assisted schools, private schools, public schools. So we have attempted to address the different kinds of schools that are on St. Lucia that are part of the education system. And we'll certainly note your question about gender and the different schools that cater to one gender only. Thank you for that.
And there's a question in the chat. Can the consultants kindly commit to making the updated document available to us prior to submission? How else would we know that our comments, even if not at all, have been considered? That is a fair question. It is not at all up to the consultants what is shared. We are engaged by the Ministry of Education, and the ministry makes the decisions about what is shared contractually. That's been in our contract since we entered into this. So we are here in service to you, and so I would suggest that if you're looking for commitment, you look for that commitment from the ministry. Although I must say that persons have commented that this is one of the most open and consultative processes that they've been aware of in quite a while in St. Lucia. So, and that's just comments that we've heard throughout our piece. We don't pass judgment one way or the other. And so I am confident that from working with those in the ministry, that it would be their intention for the sharing that we have witnessed since the beginning of this consultancy to continue. And there's more questions in the chat. I think that is it in the chat.
And actually, that's a good lead into the next slide, which is next steps.
Okay, thank you, Monica. There we go.
Oh, sorry. Your priorities and hopes going forward. I'm sorry. So we've had some animated discussion tonight, an exchange of ideas. We really want to hear what are the top 3 priorities that you think need to be addressed in the draft Education Act and regulations going forward. We want to hear what you feel are the most important issues to be addressed, because there are so many issues in education and so many different requests that have been made. We're trying to identify what are the main priorities. And what do you hope will come out of the Draft Act and regulations? What do you hope will come out of updating the Education Act? This is your Education Act. What would you like to see change as a result of it? So if you would kindly take a moment or two and put in the chat box or raise your hand and share with us what you think the top priorities are and what you hope will come out of this review, we'd really like to hear it from you.
And while persons are reflecting on that, Miss Emmanuel, who is with us tonight from the Equip office and the ministry, said stakeholder engagement will continue throughout this iterative process. So the person who was asking about consultation can be assured that will happen. And I do believe there was another comment here as well. Oh, yes, a question. Who makes up the Special Education Council? And why is special education the only group with a council? I'm not yet sure how I feel about it, it feels like exclusion. So, Dr. Williams, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, please. Thank you for the question. The composition of the Council for Special Needs Education and Inclusive Education is spelled out in the Education Act. So I'm just going to that section of the Act now so we can describe some of the members of that council for you. While I'm going to the exact page, I do want to point out there are other councils referenced in the Act, student councils. The TVET Council is described in detail in the Education Act. And with regard to the composition of the Special Needs Education and Inclusive Education Council, that's described in Section 53.2. It includes the permanent secretary of the Department of Education, the chief education officer, the education officer responsible for special education and inclusive education, the principal or proprietor of a special needs school, one person appointed on the recommendation of a national advocacy group for persons with disabilities, one teacher with expertise in special needs education and inclusive education, one representative of the St. Lucia Teachers Union, one representative of the St. Lucia Principals Association, one parent of a student with special needs, and one secondary school student with special needs. So we tried to make sure there was wide representation on the council and that many different voices would be heard. Thank you for the question.
And one of the top three things that I want to see coming out of this consultation is for the current rights of teachers to remain in the new bill as they are. The removal of these rights is not acceptable. Thank you for that comment. It has definitely been noted tonight and actually in an earlier session, and we will look into that and respond as best we can. Any other persons wanted to share their hopes for the Act? Okay, perhaps we can go to next steps, Dr. Williams.
Thank you. So what are the next steps? This question has been raised several times tonight, and it's a great question. The questions and comments provided by participants in each town hall meeting are being recorded, and they will be analyzed to identify the main topics and issues that have been raised by members of the public. These topics and issues will be addressed in the validation and finalization of the draft Act and regulations. And this final draft and accompanying report will be prepared and submitted to the Government of St. Lucia for consideration in fulfillment of our contract. I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to provide any additional information there.
No, that is the process that will complete our work as consultants, and then the process still continues as the proposed bill and regulations proceed through the approval process.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone so much for your attendance and participation here tonight and for your patience. We've gone over time a bit, but it's been a very rich discussion and we've learned a lot from you. So thank you most sincerely for that. And I'd like to ask Mr. Jarif now if he would be so kind as to provide some closing comments as we move toward adjournment of the meeting. Mr. Jarif?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Again, let me say a big thank you to our consultants, Dr. Williams, Mrs. Paula McKinnon, and Mrs. Anthony, and all those behind the scene who are part of this consultation process. Of course, I must say a big thank you to District 5 and all those who came out tonight. I know we've exceeded the stipulated time given, but it's all in the name of discussion, all in the name of moving forward in the best interest of all those involved. And so I want to say thank you. Like you heard from the team, there will be more opportunities for you to share your concerns. We have received the link for the meeting on Friday, so we will share that by tomorrow, God's willing. And you can be a part of it, so the discussion can continue. I know there are sensitive issues. I know there are concerns we have, and here's a chance to be a part of history, be a part of what would make you and your family and the generation ahead operate in an environment that everybody can work comfortably. And so again, I say thank you to you for joining. When I look at my records, I think we exceeded 110 online, plus those who probably assemble as a group. And so I want to say I feel encouraged. And so, of course, do have a blessed night. And again, thank you, team, and may God bless us all.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Looking forward to much more coming from teachers. And I don't think we mentioned once that don't forget a lot of the rights of the teachers are protected because there is a agreement with SLTU. So nothing is done in isolation. Thank you all ever so much for coming and sharing. Good night.
Good night. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.